Randolph Scott was a matinee idol in a cowboy hat, and more than that, he was a symbol of a disappearing type of man, straight, contained, dignified, and unobtrusively powerful. Behind the peaceful stare and deliberate drawl that characterized the screen heroes, there was, however, a submerged intensity that informed his life and his work. And if there was one man he really couldn't abide in Hollywood, one who was his polar opposite, it was John Wayne. He represented everything I didn't admire, Scott once explained, and he wasn't exaggerating. Randolph Scott's history started far from the dust and grime of Hollywood's frontier backlots. Born George Randolph Scott on January 23, 1898, in Orange County, Virginia, he was a member of an ancient old Southern family whose heritage was steeped in gentility, discipline, and honor. His father, George Grant Scott, was a dignified textile executive, and his mother, Lucille Crane Scott, a lady of refinement and poise. The Scotts eventually made their home in Charlotte, North Carolina, where Randolph, the second of 7 children, was raised in an environment that held education and moral fortitude in high esteem. Those early teachings on courtesy and self-control would eventually become the very hallmark of his presence on screen, the stoic cowboy who didn't have to yell to make a room take notice. There was nothing at first in Scott's early life to indicate that he would ever be a Hollywood legend. He went to private schools, then attended Georgia Institute of Technology, and later the University of North Carolina, at Chapel Hill, studying engineering. His life appeared set to follow his father's steady business or industry life. But all changed with the First World War. As an artillery officer in France, he saw the discipline and the dangers of the battle firsthand. By the time he returned home, he walked with quiet confidence and maturity that contrasted with the immaturity of his fellow young men. The war had given him a sense of purpose and maybe some restlessness that could not be fulfilled by an office cubicle. During a visit to California in the early 1920s, Scott discovered himself being attracted by the new motion picture industry. Hollywood was then raw and a land of illusion and opportunity. With the tall, athletic build and sculpted jaw, and being a courteous Southerner, casting directors took notice. Initially, he worked whatever he could get, bit roles, extras, even stunts. He learned to make movies from scratch, quietly observing, seldom bragging, continually honing his craft. It was gradual development, and Scott had something not many young actors had: patience. He wasn't in a rush for fame. He was establishing a craft. By the late 1920s, Scott had established himself in the business. With the advent of sound, his low, even baritone became an asset. Directors soon discovered that his unobtrusive authority was more commanding than bombastic histrionics. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, he played in comedies, dramas, and adventure films, but one genre above all else seemed cut to his measure: the Western. With parts in The Last of the Mohicans, 1936, Western Union, 1941, and The Desperados, 1943, Scott became the model of the noble frontiersman, a man of honor, few words, and a steadfast sense of right and wrong. He didn't play cowboys as swaggering shooters. He played them as prairie moral philosophers, men troubled by their histories but directed by a code. Unlike many of his peers who succumbed to Hollywood's excesses, Scott maintained his distance from scandal. He was punctual, professional, and unfailingly polite. He never swore, never boasted, never drank on set, one co-star recalled. This professionalism reached its peak during the 1950s when he formed a remarkable collaboration with director Bud Boetticher. Together, they made a string of spare adult westerns: Seven Men from Now, 1956, Ride Lonesome, 1959, and Comanche Station, 1960, that revised the genre. These pictures depicted men who lived by code rather than reputation and solidified Scott's reputation as one of the final screen's last truly moral heroes. Off-screen as well, Scott was every bit as intentional about his decisions. His personal life mirrored the same reserve he applied to acting. In 1936, he married Marion DuPont, daughter of William DuPont Sr. of the wealthy DuPont family. Marion was an heiress to vast fortunes, a keen horse breeder, and the owner of Montpelier, the historic Virginia homestead formerly occupied by President James Madison. Their union was one of opposites, the restrained Southern gentleman and the self-reliant East Coast aristocrat. Interestingly enough, Scott had been best man at Marion's earlier wedding, and this added a near-novelistic touch to their subsequent romance. Nonetheless, with all the pageantry around them, the marriage did not work. Their lives were too far removed, Scott's in the glittering studios of California, Marion's in the green hills of Virginia. They divorced harmoniously in 1939 after 3 years. She retained his name for the remainder of her life, a private testament to the love that never completely died. For many years, Scott was one of Hollywood's most eligible bachelors, but he was never the party type. He was a private man who preferred the warmth of close friends and his horses to nightclubs and the gossip columns. Then, in 1944, at the age of 46, came true happiness. He wedded Patricia Stillman, a young actress 21 years his junior. Unlike his initial marriage, this one was founded not on class, but on common values. Patricia retired from acting shortly thereafter to concentrate on family life, and they both developed a quiet domestic existence. They adopted 2 children, Christopher and Sandra, in 1950, and Scott was as devoted a parent as he had been an artisan in his working life. His house was warm and stable, something of a rarity in Hollywood. Guests called their marriage a refuge of calm. It lasted for 43 years, until his death in 1987. Scott's last film, Ride the High Country 1962, directed by Sam Peckinpah, was an artistic success and a suitable last one. He portrayed an aging lawman faced with a world that had passed him by, a lyrical metaphor for his own position in evolving Hollywood. He then retired from acting altogether, happy to go out on his own terms. He invested astutely in real estate and business, building a modest fortune, but never pranced about it. "I earned my money the same way I earn my films," he once declared, slowly and without cheating. At the time of his retirement, he was one of the richest actors in Hollywood, but still he lingered at his ranch outside Santa Barbara, riding horses and reading the Bible. But there was one anecdote in his long career that hung over him in shadow, his undeclared bitterness with John Wayne. To the public, both men were symbols of American masculinity, tall, stoic, brave. On posters, their silhouettes were interchangeable, broad shoulders under a Stetson, a 6-gun at the hip, eyes fixed on the horizon. But in private, Scott had a contempt for Wayne so strong that it verged on loathing. It wasn't a rivalry for fame, it was a conflict of principles. Wayne was a showman, Scott once said, and I was a craftsman. There's a difference. Acting, in Scott's view, was a discipline, a matter of restraint. He was all about doing more with less, a look, a moment of silence, a measured voice. Wayne, on the other hand, was loud, brash, full of bluster. He swaggered through performances and through life, larger than life, and frequently larger than the truth. He sold a version of the West, Scott complained, not the reality of it. He regarded Wayne's performances as theatrical, even bombastic, a success of image over substance. Hollywood loved Wayne's patriotic assurance. Scott found it simplistic. "My characters question what's right," he said, "is never due." The tension between the two men went beyond art. Their personalities could not have been more dissimilar. Scott was the personification of Southern decorum, polite, soft-spoken, and allergic to bragging. Wayne, by contrast, filled up any room he occupied, his thunderous voice and political views overwhelming conversation. He loved to debate, especially on matters of patriotism and war. Scott did not like such conversation. Politics and war, he once declared, should not be romanticized in saloons or on sound stages. Not that Scott was unpatriotic, he had served his nation with honor, but he hated making virtue a performance. And then, of course, there was World War II. Wayne remained at home, still making films, while hundreds of younger actors went off to fight. To most in Hollywood, the choice appeared cowardly, though no one would speak it. Scott, who held military service in high regard, never forgave what he perceived as duplicity. "I did not judge men who stayed home," he later said, "but I could not abide those who pretended to fight wars on the screen after declining to serve in one." That, above all else, cemented his distaste. He viewed Wayne's heroism as a marketing gesture and not a matter of principle. The hostility was seldom made public, but within the ranks it was well known. At social gatherings, Scott would discreetly leave the room if Wayne entered. Friends such as Gary Cooper and Joel McCrea frequently found themselves in the embarrassing position of not mentioning one man's name in the other's presence. Wayne once made a careless comment that Scott was too pretty to be a real cowboy. Scott never let the slight fade. He thought being loud was real. He remembered years afterward. I thought being real was being quiet. It was a precise description of their contrast, one by volume, the other by quiet. Their rivalry, while mostly behind the scenes, became a hushed rumor in and around Hollywood. To most, it represented two competing visions of the American West, Wayne's mythic heroism and Scott's moral realism. Ironically, both were required. Wayne provided the larger-than-life cowboy that the public desired. Scott provided the human being behind the legend. In tandem with each other, they sustained the Western, one in spectacle, the other in soul. But that shared contribution never mellowed Scott's vision. He was the last man I'd ride the range with, he once said coldly. It was as final as a tombstone inscription. When Scott retired from public life, he did so without bitterness. He spent his later years quietly, dividing his time between his Beverly Hills home and his ranch, riding horses well into his 70s. Friends who came to see him in his last decades discovered him satisfied and contemplative, a man at peace with his history. He still went to bed early, shined his boots, and read the Bible every day. Hollywood may have forgotten his name by the glitzy 1980s, but among genuine film historians his reputation persisted. Directors such as Clint Eastwood subsequently named Scott as an influence, not for his popularity, but for his self-discipline, his knowledge that real strength is unspoken. Randolph Scott died in 1987 at the age of 89 due to heart and lung disease in his Beverly Hills residence. He was buried in Elmwood Cemetery in Charlotte, North Carolina, the city where his career had gotten underway nearly 9 decades before. His dearly loved wife, Patricia, came after him in 2004, laid to rest alongside him. In 2008, their stylish mid-century residence was torn down, but his legacy lived on, recorded in letters, photographs, and diaries now part of the UCLA Library's special collections. Included among those documents are his own musings on religion, honor, and the moral complexity of the characters he portrayed. Randolph Scott never pursued the spotlight others sought. He left behind no scandals, no feuds splashed across tabloids. Only the serene dignity of a man who knew who he was. To his fans, he is still the quintessential Western hero, the embodiment of the old American ideal. Courage without arrogance, virtue without vanity. But beneath that image was a man who could experience deep conviction and equally deep dislike. His contempt for John Wayne was not petty jealousy, but philosophical. He felt that character was more important than charisma, integrity over image. In that regard, his finest role was not on screen but in life. The Western themselves died out long before he did, giving way to anti-heroes and irony. But if you see one of his movies today, the way he tips his hat prior to a confrontation, the hesitation before he speaks, the steel in his voice when he does, you can still see the man behind the myth. A North Carolina gentleman who traveled across a continent to represent a nation's conscience, who lived according to his own code and never compromised it. In a town founded on illusion, Randolph Scott was the most elusive thing of all real, and so, in the end, his tale is both a biography and a testament, evidence that quiet power can resonate louder than any bellow